Welcome to Sadness as a Stress Response. This corresponds vaguely to the Ekman chapter called Agony and Sadness. I say vaguely because I'm going to take a slightly different tactic than he does. You're going to need to want to focus on both different approaches to discussing this issue. He's going to be talking about the experience, and he's going to talk about how we can recognize it in each other. I'm going to talk about the effects of sadness and focus on how it can serve as a stress response and cause some of the same effects that stress can. So let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, I've already talked about this before, so I won't belabor this too much, but when we are confronted with a potentially stressful situation, we have to assess that situation and determine whether the event is a threat or a challenge. So let's say that these folks are all taking a tough math test. If they appraise that tough math test as, a threat, oh no, this is beyond me, I'm going to fail, and then if I fail this class, I'm going to have to repeat it, or it's going to prevent me from taking the next class, and so on and so forth, they can end up stressed so much and so distracted that they actually end up not doing well on the exam because they were so overly stressed, right? Whereas if you assess the same event as a challenge, hey, this is my opportunity to show everything that I know and to show that I'm ready to go on to the next class or whatever the situation is, it's going to produce a response in us, right? We're going to have a physiological response, but that response will be at the level that will allow us to be aroused and focused rather than distracted. So obviously what we are concerned about are those threat appraisals, right? When a person looks at a situation and says, this is too much and I'm not going to be up to the challenge, that's where we might end up with trouble. Now, if you recall back to when we were talking about theories of emotion, this is what Lazarus really talked about, the idea of making the appraisal of what's going on. And, I mentioned at the time that I talked about Lazarus' model that it typically is applied mostly to stress, our stress responses. But I would like to argue that it can be applied to the factors that can contribute to us feeling sad. And ultimately then could lead to depression and other things. So let's go ahead and look at some stressors, things that can push our buttons, that can cause us to feel stressed. Catastrophes. Here we have a man standing on the roof of his house as he's watching a wildfire approaching. This is an unpleasant, large-scale event. A catastrophe is something that probably impacts everybody in the region, or a lot of people are affected by that catastrophe. Significant life changes. Here's a picture of me holding my third grandbaby when she was very small. The birth of a new baby is a significant life change, especially when it's the first baby, right? Because it's the first time the parents have had that experience and things like that. But you could also argue the birth of a third child is going to have its unique stressors, right? Because it's going to be adding to the family, and it's going to throw everybody's sleep-wake cycles out of order. And now you have two older kids that you still have to take care of, and so on, right? Significant life changes are typically going to be personal events, or maybe, idiosyncratic to your family, or a very, close-knit number of people, as opposed to that catastrophe where, a lot of people are going to be impacted. With significant life changes, it's possible that the people around you might help to provide some kind of buffering for the stress, but it's more likely in a catastrophe that there's going to be some kind of organized response to that stressor, right? The Red Cross is going to show up, and FEMA is going to help to cover things. And I mean, there's like a system for catastrophes. With significant life changes, and particularly ones that are supposed to be happy, like the birth of a new baby, or getting married, or graduating from college, or something like that. These are supposed to be, happy events, but they still are life transitions that are, going to require some adjustment, and change is always hard. And it's possible that there will be less support offered in the face of a personal life event, especially a personal life event that's supposed to be a happy one, that you're supposed to be super excited for. So that's one thing that makes it a little bit more stressful, is not having that ready-made support. And then daily hassles. These are just day-to-day things. I've got a nice picture of Spokane traffic. It's just these little things like being caught in traffic, or having to stand in line, or the thing that you ordered isn't available yet, or, whatever. These kinds of little things. Finding out that the class that you enrolled in isn't actually going to count towards your degree. And now what are you going to do? These kinds of things they're not life-changing, but they are annoying, right? Like little day-to-day challenges are what we mean by daily hassles. And absolutely, there's a lot less support for daily hassles, for coping with daily hassles. And they might be the things that actually pile up and produce the most stress for most of us, right? Because we have them all day, all the time, and nobody really wants to hear about your traffic experience when they had their own traffic experience, or maybe their problem was they were trying to ride the bus and that has its own unique hassles. People don't want to really hear about your daily hassles when they've got their own daily hassles to deal with. Occasionally you might catch the right person who just wants to have a complain fest and we can all talk about our daily hassles. But a lot of times you just sort of have to cope, and there's not a lot of support for it or strategies available for dealing with them. I'll talk about some strategies that might help with all of these kinds of stressors as we get to the end of this topic of sadness as a stressor. All right. So let's take a second and talk about how researchers study stress. Here's a good example of how we know how much stress a person's under. You can have the participant chew gum so that their mouth is going to be full of saliva. Then you have them spit the saliva into a vial, and then you can test that vial for the stress hormone cortisol. Typically, when we're under stress, our body responds to that with a secretion of cortisol. So theoretically, when they come to the experiment, they shouldn't be that stressed out. So their cortisol levels probably would be higher than they would be if they were, chilling and watching YouTube or something when they first arrive in an experiment, because they don't know what's going to happen. And, so there's probably a little bit of stress going on with that. But now we put them into a stressful situation, like they have to do an interview speech in front of a critical panel, and then they have to complete some difficult math problems out loud in front of this judgmental panel. So you go through these phases, and then we again collect the saliva, right? Have them again secrete a bunch of saliva, put it in the vial, and then we look to see whether the cortisol levels increase after the stressor. So we have your baseline cortisol when you first arrive at the experiment, and then we have your cortisol after you've engaged in something stressful. So that's one really objective way to know whether a person is at the moment experiencing stress, how much cortisol their body is secreting. There are other ways that are less acute. We can administer paper and pencil tests and ask about, the stressors in a person's daily life. So we can do those kinds of strategies as well. And that's often used in research, this sort of paper and pencil stress measure. So the stress response. So you obviously have heard of the fight or flight response. And this is something that Cannon, if you go back to our discussion on theories, the Cannon-Bard theory, Cannon said that our stress response is a fight or flight system, that our stress response is designed to get us ready for a fight or prepare us to flee. Now, I found this nice image that somebody created that shows, that there actually is this other place that you can be when you're under stress, and that's sort of like you don't know what to do. You can get physically paralyzed in the face of a fight or a flight, and you're like stuck for a second, physically can't do anything. You might be mentally paralyzed. And so I wanted to make sure we throw that in, that Cannon is probably pretty accurate as far as the fact that we do have this fight or flight system, but that same system can lock us in kind of a paralysis as well. So if you recall the Cannon-Bard theory, you've got some kind of stressor. In this case, we've got the bear, and simultaneously you will experience the autonomic arousal and the conscious, emotion. I'm scared of the bear. In the circumstance we're talking about with stress, you've got some kind of stressor like a bear, and you've got the autonomic arousal. We're talking about the fight or flight system getting activated, right? And in this case, our emotion might be fear. It might be sadness. And so we're going to talk about that as our model throughout this section. Now, Selye, I think we've talked about this before. I'm kind of confused. I'm doing lectures for my personality theory class and for you guys, and there's a lot of overlap in these classes. But Selye argued that there's a 3-phase general adaptation syndrome, he says, that we go through when we experience a stressor. So in the process of our fight or flight response being activated, we have that alarm phase where, see that little dip on the left? That's that moment of freezing. So something has happened. Our brain went, whoa, something's happened. And we actually are less able to resist the stress during that little dip. And then we marshal our forces and we get ready for some kind of resistance, which is displayed in the orange band. And then after some amount of time of resistance, we're going to enter exhaustion. So we're going to use that as kind of a model for what can happen and can trigger sadness. So I want you to keep this Selye model in mind, and I'll revisit it a couple times. And then I wanted to introduce the concept of potentially sex differences in how people respond to stress. A lot of theorists have argued that the canon model of the fight or flight system might be very accurate for males, or in situations where you have a very acute and threatening stressor. It might be true for both sexes. So whether you're male or female, if there's a bear, you may have the exact same fight or flight response. But if we're talking about daily hassles, or we're talking about just sort of life stressors, life transitions and things like that, we may see sex differences in how we respond. Men may still respond with a fight or flight response, whereas women might respond with a tend and befriend response, where males may say, okay, I had a really bad commute. My boss yelled at me at work. I lost that big client. And then when I got home, the dog had pooped in the driveway and I stepped in it. Okay, so I've had a very bad day. And so when I enter the household, I can't fight with all these stressors that happened. So all I can really do is flee. And so I might mentally or physically flee from all this stress and maybe go into another room and say, everybody leave me alone. I got to decompress. I don't want to talk to anybody right now. So that would be a type of flight. Or flee through like drinking too much or smoking some pot or doing something to mentally flee so you don't have to deal with the stress that has occurred and that you can't really do anything about. Like none of these are things that can really be cured, right? So I'm going to try to probably flee from these stressful feelings that I'm having, or I might fight with the arousal that my body's experiencing. I might displace that onto something that I can fight with. So I might pick a fight with my wife or yell at the dog. Why would you poop on the driveway right where I was going to park? Like, why would you do that, you crazy dog? And be, really mean to the dog because I'm so frustrated about the accumulation of stuff that happened. Even though we all know that the dog has no idea what you're talking about unless you catch him exactly in the act of pooping on the driveway. They have no idea what you're talking about. But I'm still going to take it out on them because that's the only thing I can fight with, right? So there may be these sort of maladaptive things that can come for men when they're, tending towards this fight or flight response and they're dealing with daily hassles or, life transitions. Females, on the other hand, may fare better in the face of daily hassles and, changing life circumstances because they are more likely, when under stress, to tend and befriend. So what that means is they take care of their children or the dog or the garden or whatever. They tend to something, and it makes sort of helps them to secrete some oxytocin, and they feel nurturing rather than threatened. And so that may benefit them. Or they befriend. They reach out to a friend and they vent. They talk about all the things that happen, even though there's nothing that can be done about it. Just talking about it makes them feel better. And so there may be a slightly better response to daily hassles and significant life changes. If you go with this female approach, then you get, if you take the male approach as a response to those things. And probably both sexes display the fight or flight response in the face of like the really acute catastrophes and things like that. But it's in the case of just these certain special kinds of stress factors that can cause a sex difference to emerge. This is kind of a controversial claim. It's not clear that there really is something different in this tend and befriend. The emphasis on oxytocin, some people have been questioning that and trying to test it in a live situation, but it's kind of tricky to do, like stressors that could release oxytocin in a laboratory situation. right? Like that's a tricky thing to do. And so it's kind of a debate right now. It's sort of a theory more than, like a hypothesis more than it is an actual fact that females have this tendency and males have that. All right. Well, that's a good place to stop. Let's go ahead and stop here, and we'll come back and talk about Cellier's general adaptation syndrome in the next section.